Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group. Our topic for today, as you can see from the slide displayed on the screen, is the Maxim Machine-Gun. I would like to introduce Peter Greenspan, who's been a volunteer now for several years and who's been a longtime colleague of mine at Truman Medical Center and UMKC. He has been interested in this particular topic apparently for some time and is going to give us a talk about Hiram Stevens Maxim, both the man and the gun. Peter, you are on the air.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it. As you can see, my title is Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim, the man and the gun. I'd like to thank Dr. Van Way and Bart Parrish for allowing me to prepare this talk, and I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I have no disclosures. I wanted to also acknowledge one of our volunteers, Jerry Phillips. He advised me to obtain the social history of the machine gun by John Ellis, which was very informative, and also a good friend of mine, Jim Long, another volunteer, for having supplied me some information about the SOM, and we'll talk about that later. So why would I want to talk about Sir Hiram Maxim? I think all of us, especially because we have an interest in history, and particularly military history, would find ourselves being intrigued or interested in personalities that we read about. And it happened so that I was reading a book by General Smedley Butler, who had talked about the idea that the Maxim gun was an American invention that was used by the Central Powers to slaughter American soldiers. And that got me interested in learning more about it. This led me to discover who he was, Hiram Maxim, of course. And I would say he was definitely an eccentric genius. And I found him to be really more interesting as a personality than the gun itself. This is a photograph of him in about midlife with his prototypical Hiram Maxim gun. So as I delved into his life and accomplishments, I found this was a very unusual individual, a very interesting man with a life story that was unusual. And I thought that it would be as equally exciting to discuss him as it would be to discuss the gun itself. Again, another photo of a prototypical early Maxim repeating arm. He was a genius, but aside from that, he was controversial, and we'll discuss that during the presentation at certain junctures. He's obviously most well known because he invented this machine gun, but he also invented many things and all kinds of devices and technologies that have immensely contributed to the improvement of modern life on the planet. For example, he invented a self-loading mousetrap, and he was also an aeronautical engineer. Very interesting fellow, really. Most notably, of course, he perfected and patented the incandescent light bulb, but he never got any real credit for it because that was stolen from him by Thomas Edison. This is a bone of contention inside of the extant literature when we're reading about these two personalities. But nonetheless, there was a great amount of intrigue and chicanery having to do with the light bulb, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's Thomas himself, and there's the light bulb that was the prototype invented and developed by Hiram Maxim. He was born in Sangerville, Maine, which is fairly rural, as I understand, in 1840, the winter of 1840. He was apparently from French Huguenot stock. He became an apprentice coach builder at the age of 14. And then in his mid-20s, he started working in a mill for his uncle Levi Stevens in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. The Huguenots, as I understand it, were much like the original Pilgrims in that they were escaping France for religious persecution reasons. They were apparently some type of a Calvinistic group. And the thing that we'll talk about later is that Maxim himself would have none of that. He was irreligious and an atheist, and we'll discuss that later. And this is, again, another rendition of the Huguenots leaving France to come to the Americas. This mill that he worked at in Fitchburg was very much mouse infested. So this gave Hiram an opportunity to show his ingenuity when he developed an automated mousetrap. It's the design that's still in common use today in many households, actually all over the world. These menaces, of course, would interfere with the ability to be productive at work, so that's why he came up with this invention. He was considered, I'd say, a tinkerer. He was very prolific at inventing. He was very insightful of all kinds of ideas that would pop into his head. He would, in his writings, he would often talk about staying up all night with an idea until he had it down on paper. He was considered a draftsman. He didn't have professional training, but he was a draftsman, and that gave him the skill to be able to draw things up, so to speak, and make an invention become, an idea become a real physical invention. He got a patent at the age of 26 after the Civil War by inventing a hair curling iron, of all things. He also invented a fascinating type of illuminating gas lamp, which was then patented as a locomotive lamp. This is a photo here that shows this original curling iron. And this is the prototype of the lamp that we're talking about. Excuse me. Now, in about 1878, he became the chief engineer of the United States Electric Lighting Company. And this was the first such company in North America to exist. While there, he was able to develop a manufacturing technique for carbon filaments. When we get into the discussion about the light bulb, a lot of the issue in the light bulb had to do with all kinds of people invented ways of illuminating glass bulbs, but they didn't have ways of making filaments that would last longer than maybe 15 hours. So this is where he comes in. But once he did develop it, it became essential for the mass production of incandescent bulbs all over the world. And this is an advertisement from that very company back in the 1870s. He also had bronchitis, and he invented, interestingly, a steam inhaler, a menthol inhaler, a few years before his death. But ironically, the medical profession of the day thought of him as being a quack, and they criticized him widely for this. This is a antique kit that shows the Sir Hiram Maxim pipe of peace and inhaler. He found himself fascinated with the idea of flight and then ventured into aeronautical science. He experimented with airplanes. He actually produced an airplane with a light steam engine that actually was able to fly. It got off the ground. And this was a decade before the Wright brothers were able to produce their first flight. He did recognize, Maxim did understand that the real future of flight was going to be the internal combustion engine, but he just didn't develop it. He decided to look at other things. This is one of the examples of one of the airplanes he built, moderately complex looking. And in the center, you might be able to note here, down here, there's actually a steam engine. What's fascinating, too, in the literature is that the aeronautical engineers of the future, past his time, they realized that his aircraft designs were so far more advanced than anything that was existing in his day, and they were not implemented during his lifetime for the simple fact that the technology to make these ideas into actual aircraft had not yet been developed or invented. So he was like a Leonardo da Vinci, if you will. Here's some examples again of some of the, that's one of the steam engines for an airplane. But also you can see on the left and right other drawings and examples of aeronautical inventions from Sir Hiram. He altogether had 271 patents in the United States and Great Britain, and that included automatic sprinkling systems, automatic steam-powered water pumps, vacuum pumps, engines, engine governors, et cetera. As you can see, automatic fire extinguishers, the self-setting mousetrap we already talked about, and various gas motors. The interesting story about the automatic sprinkler system was the idea that there was a furniture company that hired him to come up with a solution of how to prevent the company from periodically burning to the ground. This was in the 1860s, the 70s, and 80s. So he came up with the idea that you could actually actuate the sprinkler system by the fire itself. And he also had developed a technique to be able to notify the local fire department. It's a pretty fascinating man. Here's what I think is more amazing than anything else. He had no formal education at all. He attended a single classroom schoolhouse in rural Maine for about 5 years. And everywhere else in all of the writings and all the historical and biographical material, there's no evidence that he had any other formal education whatsoever. And just for the sake of visual, I threw in a one-room schoolhouse and what it might have looked like in his time in the he was born in 1840, so this would be in the late 40s and early 1850s. Now we're going to discuss a little bit more about the fact that Sir Maxim and Edison were rivals, and if we're going to get into the history of the light bulb again, we'll find that they were neck and neck in the development, but there were lots of people competing for the light bulb, and it even went back to about the early 1800s when people started getting the idea that you could enclose a filament inside of a bulb and apply an electrical current to it, and that would generate light. But it wasn't much light, and it didn't last long. In the mid-1880s, Maxim had surpassed Edison at this point, and he had already really produced the first practical incandescent light bulb. And also, just, I suppose, to, stick a finger in Edison's eye, so to speak, he then Hiram patented the first efficient electric current generator, and once again relegated Edison to second place. I didn't want to spend a real lot of time talking about Edison per se, but I will say this. I think history has written Edison as being a very difficult person to get along with, someone that had a lot of questionable scruples, etc. So having said all that, as the designer of electrical systems, we have Sir Hiram installing the first electric lights in a New York City building, the Equitable Insurance Company, in the late 1870s. There's a television show, a drama that's called The Gilded Age, and it's just a period piece. It's pretty well done, I'd say. And in this 5 or 6 episodes that exist of this particular show, there's actually a scene where a bunch of the aristocrats and the elites of the New York so-called 400 actually gather to watch the Equitable Insurance Company lighting take place. Again, he had developed the hardening of the carbon filament for these bulbs, and that paved the way for the electric bulb that then was basically stolen, if you will, by Thomas Edison. This is that building. There's no current photograph of it because it burned to the ground some years later. Now, these developments that Sir Hiram had worked on became very problematic because Edison had all kinds of financial backers and patrons, et cetera, and they didn't like the fact that Hiram was doing all this great stuff to undermine Edison's work. So they offered him an employment opportunity, and that was to go as a roving technical advisor to Edison's European operations of the United States, of the U.S. Electrical Company. But this came with a non-disclosure, and it was a firm understanding that he would not continue electrical inventions for the next 10 years. He would cease all electric inventions for the next 10 years. But it had to be, something had to be given, to Hiram to make him want to do this, obviously, an incentive to leave the United States, move to Europe, et cetera. These are just advertisements from some of Maxim's companies up to the point before he moves to Europe. So there was a carrot, if you will, for this move. These investors offered him the incredible salary of $20,000 US per year in that 1888 or whatever time frame. And in 2022 dollars, that was about $5.7 million a year. That was quite a salary. You know, he accepted the offer. And I think that it's important that it just shows you that, you know, he was willing to take the money, but it was for a good purpose too. This made him financially independent. He grew up in a very modest environment. He didn't have much money, but now he was awash in cash, and thus he was able to finance any personal project he wanted without depending on any other entity to help pay for it. And then with this financial independence, he found himself really enjoying living in Europe and advancing his inventions. So the machine gun idea, the development of a firearm, came from a very interesting conversation that's recorded in several of the biographers' works about an acquaintance he ran into in Vienna in the early 1880s. This is the exact quote. "Oh, hang your chemistry and electricity. If you want to make a pile of money, invent something that will enable these Europeans to cut each other's throats with great facility." I can't make a reference to that other than what the biographers say, and his own biography says it. But the point is that in one fashion or the other, it's a fairly same quote. For, you know, words are different here and there, but the gist of it is this other person told him, you know, make some device to help the Europeans kill each other off. This is basically a model of about mid-1870s, 1880s Vienna with the Stephansdom, the magnificent church there, right in the center of the city, that church is about 1,000 or so years old. Anyway, he was interested in firearms when he was a young man, but he really wasn't a hunter or anything like that. He didn't really go shooting with friends or anything. In the Civil War era, at the end of 1865, someone allowed him to fire a Springfield rifle, and he was surprised by the strength of the recoil. In his own autobiography, he says he was knocked down by the recoil. That's a Springfield firearm from that era right there. Anyway, this made him think. So he says, quote, that the energy of the kick of a military rifle would be amply sufficient to perform all the functions of loading and firing, so that if the cartridges were strung together in a belt, a machine gun might be made in which it would only be necessary to pull the trigger, when the recoil would feed the cartridge into position, close the breech, release the sear, extract the empty case, expel it from the arm, and bring the next loaded cartridge into position. I don't need to explain how this gun works because I just explained to you what he said in his own words. That's exactly what he invented. So years passed, and being an electrical engineer and very distracted with that work, he had other pursuits. He wasn't thinking about developing it that much, but he did eventually come around to the idea that he should take this advice seriously. And then in 1881, he set up a workshop at 57D Hatton Garden in London. In about 3 years' time, he was now producing the world's first practical machine gun. This is 57D Hatton Garden from two different angles. The building is still occupied, probably condos, I can't say for sure. Anyway, but nonetheless, I've come to learn that Hatton Garden is a kind of a mixture of an industrial area plus also a upscale living area. He started to exhibit the gun, and then at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in April of 1885, the gun caused a considerable amount of fuss. People were very excited about it. He was awarded a gold medal at the International Inventions Exhibition in Paris in that era, and this is the existing Institution of Mechanical Engineers in London, England today. He called his invention a little daisy of a gun, and it could spray out about 2,000 rounds in about 3 minutes. Initially, the performance of this firearm impressed the military observers from Britain, and they did submit an order that would allow him to establish the Maxim Machine-Gun Company in London, England. And on those buildings that we just looked at is this plaque, which says what it says, Hiram Maxim, Sir Hiram Maxim, the inventor. Now, he found out shortly after this that it was one thing to build a gun and invent it and to tinker with it and improve it, but it was also another thing to sell it. When he started to try to get this firearm sold across Europe, the it became apparent to him that the Europeans preferred the Nordenfelt machine gun, which was a multi-barrel firearm that required a crank, much like the Gatling gun. And this is an example of what that might have looked at. And of course, you see it's self-loading, it's gravity loading, requires a crank, would be very difficult to aim, very difficult to maneuver with, etc. There were other mechanized firearms prior to the Maxim. And of course, we've already mentioned the Gatling and the Nordenfelt. These guns, as I just said, required multiple barrels, a crank system to operate, and they just were not as efficient when it came to aiming and firing. This is a prototypical late Civil War, latter Civil War and late 1800s Gatling. And this is an example of Russian soldiers with a Nordenfelt firearm. I don't know exactly from how long ago that was, but we're at the turn of the century. So the distinctives, though, that made Maxim Gun unique was the fact that it was recoil powered as a repeating firearm. It emitted the bullets through a single barrel, which was fabulous, and it could fire hundreds of rounds a minute without stopping to reload. This is one of the schematics of the early Maxim Gun from the era that I'm talking about now. Now, Maxim Company would be eventually merged with Nordenfelt in England, and that formed the Maxim Nordenfelt Guns and Ammunition Company. Slowly over time, some of these governments started to show some interest in this gun, and this is what the prototype was with the added water jacket at that point in time. Now, a British steelworks that was owned by the brothers Vickers, two brothers, they were an engineering conglomerate, and they understood that Great Britain was going to need to do something to step up its game against the threatening German Navy. So at the very turn of the century, Vickers bought the Maxim Nordenfelt operation for a staggering 1.35 million pounds, which in 2022 is $191 million. So when we talk about people that we think are rich today, like Bill Gates and people like that, someone to be able to get $191 million worth of value out of their company would be extraordinarily rich. And this is an advertisement from when Vickers was advertising just their engineering firm before they got into the business of making guns. Anyway, in 1897, this new company, which was called Vickers, Sons and Maxim Limited, realized that they wanted to be doing something even greater than just producing this machine gun. So they purchased the shipyards of the Barrow Shipbuilding Company, and then they would have the unique position of producing both dreadnoughts and machine guns, which were quintessential, obviously, to the looming war. This is an ad from Vickers, Sons and Maxim back in that day, and this is, of course, His Majesty's Armored Cruiser Natal, which was an early dreadnought. So the merger, along with clever marketing, would bring the attention of this gun and would cause increased orders from the European governments across the entire continent, and of course, Russia as well. The United States military, though, was not impressed, and they were focusing on other technologies. They initially didn't really find it an interesting thing at all. And there was a particularly odd, as I say here, a particularly odd reaction to the Hiram gun from the British hierarchy, the British military establishment. Charlie and I talked about this recently, and actually he shed some good insight into this, and I'll get to it in a minute. A lot of that sort of weirdness about it was based on the fact that there was some logistical problems of being able to reload these types of armaments, these rapid fire arms, which included artillery guns, and trying to figure out how to get that through a muddy, cornfield that's been blown to bits became an issue. So they weren't really so sure they wanted to get into it that much, but they changed their mind. By the way, this is a short video that's going to demonstrate Sir Hiram Maxim, colorized, as you can see, firing his own machine gun. It's only 15 seconds. Just astounding in my opinion, that he just invented all this. That's it. Notice, if you will, that Hiram's body didn't move 1 inch while he was firing that gun. That's how much he was able to manifest that recoil energy into being able to change the shells, the cartridges from the firing chamber down into the ejection pathway. Absolutely astounding. So as the Maxim and Vickers machine gun continued to develop and improve, the hierarchy in the British military was unusually resistant. And this was a thought, they thought the gun was a novelty, actually, and that it would have no practical application on the battlefield. But, eventually they changed their mind. Again, another example of an early Vickers gun where they had the corrugated sheet metal, which made the water container a whole lot lighter and more practical. And this, again, is another drawing of the same firearm with the cooling jacket and the condensing can that would be able to hide the steam, because the steam would give away the position of the gun, obviously. Anyway, most of this was due to the establishment leadership in the military that were officers that were either aristocrats or gentries. And in that type of society, they didn't get their hands dirty with machine guns or anything else. They let the other people, get dirty. But they did cling to these 18th and 19th century notions of war as being sort of a romantic thing, and that it was conducted by cavalry and frontal assaults and, hip, hip hooray and this kind of thing. A great example here of a young British cavalryman standing next to his steed. So leaders, they still believed in this glorious cavalry and, above all, the supremacy of man, as opposed to the mere machines that we could use to kill each other. And this is a charge. Assuming, as I learned from our own museum exhibit about the photography during the war, I'm going to assume this was staged, like most photographs of that time, but it shows a cavalry charge. So this officer and a gentleman philosophy espoused that battle between these adversaries should be conducted by hand-to-hand combat, and that the ultimate success was really a function of the verve or the bravery of the given soldier and not really technology. And again, these are diagrammatic representations of men charging the hill and getting involved in very close quarters combat, which resulted in horrible death. The logistics experts, as Dr. Van Wey and I discussed, did have this legitimate concern because these repeating arms and artillery guns had to consume ammunition at rates that made their supply replacement very cumbersome, if not impossible. And that, of course, we'll talk about a little bit more here, was secondary to the fact that the vast majority of the force that brought the materiel to the actual combat lines were horses. And here we have examples of, this is a railway system that was built for the First World War on the right. So this was, again, about the idea that troops and supply movements were driven by horses. And there's been lots written about the war horse. There's been movies made. And in the 21st century, a lot of people pay a great deal of homage and respect to these poor animals that actually suffered a great deal in this war. In this photo on the right shows an ammo dump, and over here on the far right side, right over in this area, is the back ends of horses who are carrying off these munitions to the battlefield. So as the 20th century dawned, this philosophy of combat, of course, was being abandoned by the people that were opposed to Britain. And they were much more in favor of modern warfare technology, and especially they embraced this repeating firearm. In the museum, in our own collection I've lost count. There's got to be at least 5 or 6 Maxim style machine guns, including that Russian gun, the MX-10, I think it is. This is a bunch of German soldiers here. You can see them. And they're holding grenades, etc. These are Austro-Hungarian troops in a colorized photograph of their uniforms. And then this is a drawing of, I would say these are probably Germans who are firing Maxim machine guns in an open field. Well, the British began to think about the fact that there was some value to the Maxim gun, especially because they were very effective in quashing all of the opponents of the imperial enterprises of Great Britain. So as colonialism expanded in the 19th and early 20th century, the local populations of these colonies were increasingly hostile to the British, obviously, and they didn't like the fact that they were taking over their countries and regions. And this was especially the case in Africa. But remember, they were colonializing India and other parts of the world. So they were developing quite a slew of enemies, I should say. Again, this is another photograph of a group of British military with Africans in the foreground. I don't know exactly which country that was, but this was a problem. It was becoming a problem for Britain. Another photograph, same idea, native tribes people with British aristocrats in a African nation someplace. So Hiram Maxim decided that he would donate one of his guns to the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition in the mid-1880s. And that was, of course, way before World War I, but it was the start of usage in the field. And this was given to Henry Morton Stanley of Stanley Livingstone fame. One of the first uses of the gun by these forces was in the Yoni expedition. And here again is a picture of Stanley himself actually firing an early Maxim machine-gun, the one that he was given apparently. And here's another graphic that shows native insurrection with British, mechanized British troops firing firearms that were far more sophisticated than what the natives could have. So this same prototype by Stanley was brought back to Africa by Frederick Lugard. And Lugard, I guess, he was a British diplomat and, a member of the military that was involved in Hong Kong and Nigeria, et cetera, and so forth, and credited as being big involved in the African imperialism expansion. And this gun that he was using, the prototype, was part of the Uganda Protectorate. So any one of these things, if you look them up, you'll hear all about how these battles took place, what the casualties were like, and they would also bring up the fact that they were largely aided by a Maxim machine-gun. Excuse me. This again is a photograph here from the Uganda Protectorate that shows what looked like native troops that are dressed in some type of uniform supplied to them. That's Lugard right there, Frederick. And again, another photo showing a ship being launched from an African port. So the first Matabele War in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, was when the Maxim was introduced at big, in a large scale. And then during Shangani, there were about 700 soldiers that were able to keep around 5,000 Matabele warriors at bay with just 5 machine guns. It was a very important part of the scramble for Africa in the later 19th century. And these are depictions of these battles that I'm talking about here. These are paintings, of course, but this is a reenactment and of British or Australian troops with a Maxim Norfelt, prior to the Vickers modification, firing this gun. Very, very interesting. Anyway, we have a recently retired member of the Truman University Health faculty named Dr. Mark Byler, family physician, who has spent most of his career in Zimbabwe. And I was at his house last night for dinner, and we had a long discussion. He knew a lot about this Matabele rebellion, and they're still not happy about it over there. So you can understand. So the lethality of this devastating gun was basically, made anything, other charging tactics, et cetera, completely obsolete. When the African opponent would be lured into a pitched battle in an open terrain. So the imperialists with machine guns versus African nationals with spears and swords would give us a whole new insight into the phrase of bringing a knife to a gunfight. Because in one Zulu insurrection, there was something like 7,000 or 7,000 casualties just by a handful of machine guns because they could not, get close enough to the British to hurt them or cause them any significant harm. And here's an example of that. Actually, I think that is from the Zulu, one of the Zulu battles that took place. And another example, again, of the British involved in a pitched battle. What we know now historically is that prior to the First World War, there were no less than 28 wars or insurrections and revolutions that employed the Maxim machine gun all over the planet. And again, all this prior to World War One. And this is, again, a British company of machine gunners that are clearly in some imperial place. I think this is Africa with a Maxim gun right there. Even in 1910, by then, there was a French general of infantry who said that this device doesn't really make any difference at all. They just didn't understand. But at the end of the war, the French Hotchkiss gun, which was in mass production, was widely used, of course, but at this point in time on the Western Front with devastating effect. And that's an example of a Hotchkiss. We have a very nice Hotchkiss in the museum as well, a couple of them actually. But the British continued to drag their feet in the 20th century. They thought that, at the time that they entered the Great War itself, they were only assigning 2 Maxims per battalion. And of course, the Germans had way many more than that. Finally, they realized the Expeditionary Force figured out that they needed to have a machine gun corps, and this was then formed by the time the armistice took place on 1918. There were 6,400 officers and 125,000 soldiers that were helping to run the machine gun corps. That was about 20 soldiers to each officer. This is an example of that corps in operation, staged photograph, of course, but showing the men with the gun. This is probably staged, but again, a Vickers Maxim being fired by a crew out in the open. And this was their badge that they wore. So there were other automatic firearms that were introduced again and widely implemented at the time of the First World War. And most notably our Lewis gun, developed by Army Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis in 1911. As you walk in, we've all seen it as you walk right into the East Gallery there on the left is a beautiful example of a Lewis gun. And there's others in other places too. Anyway, these senior officers, however, at the beginning of the Great War, they just kept this notion that war should be a matter of the will, that it required grit and resolution, for the individual soldier to just throw themselves on the enemy. And that was more important than any kind of machinery. So those who opposed this position, who were pro-Maxim, they were thought of as believing in gimmickry or some nonsense. And the chief recipients, again, of this criticism were those who were supportive of the Maxim. But another thing that was interesting, I thought this was fascinating, another technology that was criticized and avoided in the First World War was the telephone. They just didn't get it. How amazing that was. So it took a little while for them to come around. There's a little example of one of the field telephones of the Great War. The change in this attitude started when the British Expeditionary Force decided or realized that the traditional rifle combat against withering machine gun fire from Germans was just inadequate. Their men could not cross a field. It was just impossible. So therefore, any type of battlefield advancement was just untenable. This caused a stalemate, which resulted in this war of no movement. And we all are aware of the fact that the Great War, especially in the trench warfare part of it, was largely a huge amount of loss of life and materiel to gain basically no ground to speak of. British firepower without a gun like Maxim would be entirely ineffective. And this shows a colorized photo again of the Germans with the Pickelhaubs. And this is also a German who's firing one of their Maxim variants. Finally, the high command thought that their idea of valor and gallantry, et cetera, and so forth, was a little, it's had its day, and they decided that they needed to authorize and order specialized machine gun training, and then ordered at that point in time 20,000 more Maxim Vickers guns to the trenches. And here again are photographs of demonstrations of people. I'm going to say that the fellow here on the right is probably firing a Lewis. But either way, you get the idea that they realized that they had to start using crossfire and machine gun, strafing, et cetera, to be effective. So this leads us to the conclusion, basically, which I talk about, which is about the mythology of the Maxim gun. The history of the gun has been associated with all kinds of myths and legends, and I found that very fascinating and delved into it. So this is the same photograph I'm using for the background of my slides of a sleeping soldier, probably exhausted, et cetera, next to his Maxim machine gun. Let's talk about the whole 9 yards. So this phrase is commonly associated, again, with the length of the ammunition belt. The phrase that we've heard, give them the whole 9 yards. This was attributed to firing the full belt. Now, what's interesting, though, is that the original Maxim and Vickers belts only held about 250 rounds, and they would only be 20 feet long, which meant that they were only 6 2/3 yards. So that's not the whole 9 yards, obviously. And that's an example of the Vickers belt right there. So the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association states that the U.S. 50 caliber Browning gun with 50 caliber ammunition with metal links in their belts was the one that carried the 350 rounds, or about 13 rounds per foot. And that meant that a 350 round belt would be roughly 9 yards. And this is an example of what would be expended when you fired this gun after several belts, just a huge pile of shells and metal clips, etc. So despite the utilization, of the Maxim for about 2 decades prior to the Great War, none of the historians, none of the people that study languages and things like that have come up with any direct evidence that the expression was ever used during that period of time. It seems to have surfaced probably after the Second World War. So we are going to conclude that this is a myth. The P-51 fighter was armed with these types of machine guns that had 9-yard belts. And a lot of people believe that's probably where the expression came from, that the pilots would give the opponent the whole 9 yards. Anyway, moving on. What about using urine to provide fluid for the water cooling jacket? People have mused about that for a long time. It's vitally important to keep the water levels, very replenished in the jacket. Otherwise, the gun will jam or it'll break altogether. So it was said that soldiers would urinate into the guns, and that would be able to allow it to remain operational by using funnels. So it turns out, now I'm not implying here that this shell art is an example of what was used. I know that our museum has a magnificent collection of shell art, and I'm just saying, though, that there were just a lot of spent shells around, and it would be conceivable that this would be a receptacle for someone to be able to collect urine and then pour it into the gun. I think that's very plausible. There was a report that was filed by the BEF 100th Machine Gun Company during the Somme that says, during the attack on August 24th, 1916, at least 4 petrol tins of water, besides all the water bottles of the company and the urine tins from the neighborhood, were emptied into the guns for cooling purposes. Turns out that Corporal John Young of the 12th Machine Gun Company stated during an interview years later, often in a pinch, when water was short, we were forced to fill the barrel jacket with urine. It helped make the war a bit more personal. And I would conclude that this is true. This is actually true. And that's an example of, that's actually a photograph of the 12th Machine Gun Company, but we cannot identify John Young in that photo because there's no label. What about boiling tea in the water jacket? This was a very popular myth for a long time. Approximately 1,000 rounds being fired through the gun would make the water boil. And so they'd have to collect the steam in a condenser can, again, so that the steam wouldn't give away the position of the gun. Smokeless gunpowder made a big difference in that area, too. It was said that the soldiers would use this boiled water for making tea. But this water would have been very foul. It would have been tainted with oil from the barrel and from asbestos packing. It just doesn't seem tenable that they would be able to drink that water. here we can see British soldiers that are making something. Maybe it was tea, who knows? But anyway, the accounts for this, it just seems to me obvious that this water would not be potable. It just wouldn't be drinkable. But it could have been more likely used maybe for shaving or bathing. So that would make some sense. We're going to say that this is a myth that's indeterminate, but I'm siding with the idea that they didn't use it to drink water for tea. That would have been just foul. Here's another example of some fellows that are protecting themselves from the rain and trying to boil up some water. This is another interesting, questionable story about the 1 million rounds that were fired in 12 hours. My hat tip here is to my friend Jim Long. We had several discussions about this, and he provided me with some information. In the same Battle of the Somme in 1916, it was recorded that 6 to 10 machine guns from the 100th Machine Gun Group fired almost 1 million rounds in 12 hours per orders. They were ordered to do it in support of the advance on High Wood. This was the plaque that was on display, I think, in the exhibit hall before I became a volunteer. And this is what Jim showed me, provided for me, which gives this account. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but embedded in this account is the discussion of being able to use urine to cool the guns. However, this is important information. These accounts have been subject to lots of research. There was a definitive article that was published in the First World War Studies Journal of 2018, which is after the Somme exhibit in the museum, as far as I can tell, that concluded that this contention was logistically impossible. It would not be possible for that many number of rounds to have been spent in that period of time. It was more likely about 100,000 rounds, which is a lot of rounds. But again, I would say that this is a myth. And that's with all due respect to the soldiers that suffered, et cetera, and so forth. I just think that this is hard to believe, actually. So the last of this is that our friend Sir Hiram became a British subject in about 1900, and he was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1901. She, however, died, so it was King Edward who actually did the whole thing with the swords on his shoulders, et cetera, according to what I read. He invented all of the current mechanisms for automatic fire, the recoil we talked about, the gas, and the blowback. All of these were patented between 1883 and 1885. And there's a picture of him with some regalia there. He also created an amusement ride, very popular in his day and still to this day, based on one of his engineering designs for aircraft, and that was called the captive flying machine. He was also deaf because he didn't wear protection, and he just loved showing his gun off and blew his brains out, his eardrums out from constantly firing this gun. I thought that was rather interesting. Excuse me. Now, why did I put an asterisk here to say that he was an atheist? This is interesting. I mentioned that he was supposedly descendants of Huguenots who were Protestants, Calvinists, but he had none of that. He was not interested at all in religion. His logistic and brilliant mind was beyond any kind of imagination that had to do with supernaturality or anything like that. He read the Bible. He thought the Bible miracles were ridiculous, and he was outspoken about it. But something came up when he went to the Imperial Russia to market his machine gun. And fascinatingly enough, you couldn't enter into the Tsarist Russia without declaring that you belonged to a religion. An atheist wouldn't do. They wouldn't conduct commerce or any business with atheists. So while he was filling out the application, according to his autobiography, he made the comment, well, I guess I'm a Protestant. And so he wrote down Protestant and was able to go to Russia and sell them the gun. But he, in fact, was not a believer. He was actually an anti-missionary. He strongly objected to missionaries. He worked against missionaries in China and places like that. Just an interesting quirk of his personality. That's the captive flying machine in a modern amusement park being used to this day. We're going to return to that steam inhaler. He got into all kinds of accusations that he was, quote, prostituting his talents and doing this on quack nostrums. Well, he commented shortly before his death, and this is really profound and it's also poignant. From the foregoing, it will be seen that it is very credible to invent a killing machine and nothing less than a disgrace to invent an apparatus to prevent human suffering. Good point. And again, that's a photograph of one of his kits, different than the other kit. He had a son whose name was Hiram Percy Maxim, and he was also a prolific inventor and an engineer. He was credited, among many things, of inventing the firearm silencer. He also helped to invent and to develop cordite. I wanted to make a comment about cordite. We all know that was the big advancement into smokeless powder. Hudson Maxim, Hiram's brother, and Percy and others were all involved in its development. When the patent was actually issued, it was issued to H. Maxim. Well, Hiram thought it was his invention, and he was kind of that way. He thought everything was his, and probably was. But also, H. Maxim could have stood for Hudson. So Hudson decided he was going to take credit for that patent, and that caused a rift in their family that was never resolved, as far as I can tell. Just an interesting little aside. Anyway, Percy was a pioneer of the radio engineering specialty, and he also was an amateur radio operator in his day and founded, with other people, the American Radio Relay League, and that's a picture of Percy Maxim. Also, Percy wrote a biographical book called A Genius in the Family, which takes place between Percy's age of about maybe 7 and maybe about 12, which tells all these kind of adorable stories about how his father being a prankster and a goofball, and he just played tricks on people, and he just was a lot of fun, apparently. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, here's an example of the Maxim silencer, or the, what's the other word? Not silencer, but, anyway, whatever the word is, I can't remember. Okay, so just to make a mention of the fact that the ARRL is the largest membership organization of ham operators in the entire world. It's still quite very much in existence in Newtonton, Connecticut, and it transmits 24/7, 365. If a person wants to learn Morse code, for example, they could tune into the ARRL and learn and practice Morse code at various speeds. Charlie and I are both ham operators. I am not a currently licensed operator. Mine is expired. But anyway, the whole thing is that this station is called W1AW, and that was Hiram Percy Maxim's call sign before it became the ARRL. Unlike his father, he did obtain a formal education. He went to MIT, graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. Okay, and that's the call sign there and the building of the Hiram Percy Maxim Memorial Station of W1AW. Okay, so this is the last. I was going to show you just a second here. The Maxim gun, in this particular instance, the Vickers Maxim, is actually in use right now in the Ukrainian conflict. And I'm not saying anything political or anything else. I'm just going to say that this was a demonstration that was, and of course, this is staged, obviously, but you're seeing a 100-year-old Maxim or so being fired in the Ukraine as we speak. So anyway, at the end here, Sir Hiram died November 24, 1916, right before the start of the Battle of the Somme. He was a rare and unique genius, I would say. He changed the course of history with his amazing inventions. Historians have estimated at this point that the Maxim machine guns and all of their variations have caused no less than 20 million deaths and many more million untold injuries. Thank you. So, if there are any questions, I'll make up answers for you.
Peter, that was just excellent.
Thank you.
It's clear that all sides in World War I were using Maxim guns, maybe not the French, but the British, the Russians, the Italians.
Absolutely.
Everybody, everybody was using the Maxim gun. Obviously, the company was no longer selling it to the Germans, but I assume that they set up their own manufacturer.
Yes.
And produced it under license. And that gun I want to point out that gun that you showed us in the Ukraine is very similar to the Russian
Yes,
Maxim that's on display in the East Gallery in the museum.
correct. It is a Russian Maxim, the MK10 or whatever the exact numbers. You're correct. There was an article about it. I might have been Time Magazine, actually. That's what got me interested in finding that video, was that they were the article in one of the news sources was that the Ukrainian forces were using a 100-year-old machine gun or 100-year-old machine guns. So there's more than one there. But you're correct. 7 or 8 various governments began producing their own gun. Finland, the Soviet Union, what we would call eventually the Soviet Union, and the United States would eventually adapt it, of course, and they used it up until and including the Korean War.
Any other comments or questions?
I sure appreciate everybody listening. I hope it was worth your trouble, and I'm very honored to be a volunteer and to be among the youth individuals. It's an exceptional group of people. So with that, I'll stop sharing here, and then I will be done.